I want to give a little disclaimer for this particular speech and lecture. I'm using a text of Freud's that is in part that you didn't read, and I have permission to do so. But the reason I'm using this text is because Frida Kahlo made a painting on it. So in this paper, I contrast Frida Kahlo's artistic appreciation of multicultural spirituality expressed in her painting Moses with Freud's theories put forward in his book Moses and Monotheism, which is this book, in which he proposes the psychological underpinnings of religious development and his reimagining of the biblical Moses motif in Judaism. While Freud and Frida both engage with religious and cultural history through Moses, their methodological approaches represent fundamentally opposing philosophical positions. One that interprets spiritual experience through psychological mechanisms, and another that expands it through inclusive multicultural vision. I draw on David Alfaro Securo's Valet Exports and Frida Kahlo's essay on Moses, which illuminates her artistic and philosophical intentions. The biblical account of Moses' death further supports my thesis that Freud's reinterpretation serves as a fictional argument to reinforce his psychoanalytical framework rather than a respectful engagement with long-standing Jewish belief and heritage. In contrast, Frida thoughtfully honors these traditions, using the figure of Moses to bridge diverse cultural perspectives and highlighting humanity's shared spiritual narratives. Freud's Moses and Monotheism serves as a central text for this analysis, while the cited articles in Charles Harrison and Paul's Wood Art and Theory offer a broader intellectual framework of examining Freud's constrained perspective alongside Frida's expansive vision. She centers the painting around the baby Moses, both as a fetus and an infant, floating serenely in his basket among the reeds, just as the biblical account relates. This affirms that Moses will rise to greatness despite Freud's arguments, reimagining his narrative as a universal symbol of spiritual interconnectedness rather than merely a product of patriarchal monotheism. With a touch of irony, Frida depicts Moses with a third eye of enlightenment, an element she usually reserves for her glorified husband Diego. Frida's painting is characteristic of her lively, playful spirit, her unusual juxtapositions of disparate cultures, and ancient and reverential with the modern and industrial, and the exalted spiritual with worst evils imaginable. In Moses and Monotheism, Freud suggests a radical interpretation of religious history, proposing that monotheistic faith is a result of primordial psychological conflicts. Freud examines the psychological foundations of religious development by considering Moses as an Egyptian figure who introduces monotheism to the Hebrew people. His argument is predicted on the notion that monotheistic devotion is the unconscious result of repressed patriarchal impulses and collective trauma, expressed through the Oedipal complex. Freud asserts that early human societies experienced a collective trauma due to the assassination of a fundamental parental figure, which engenders guilt suppressed through generations. This repressed guilt leads to the development of religious structures that simultaneously suppress and manifest underlying psychological dysfunction, rather than being predominantly religious or divine. This paradigm characterizes religious experience as a complex psychological mechanism that functions as a remedy for unresolved ancestral conflicts lingering in the unconscious. Frida's responds to Freud's ideas by manifesting a painting that offers a symbolic tribute to a diverse array of religious and mythological figures, with Moses as the central focus. Frida's work challenges Freud's psychoanalytic framework by adopting a perspective that recognizes individuals who have influenced the world through intellectual and spiritual contributions, quote, the high-class reformers of religious and human society, end quote. Her painting emphasizes the relevance of all who have come and gone and left a mark. changing humanity forever. Incorporating wide-ranging ideologies and beliefs, she unifies the human experience, while Freud's book presents a psychological analysis of his constructed views on the origins of monotheism. Freud and Frida were both products of the cultural millennia of the 1930s, a period that witnessed a blossoming of artistic and creative energy, which introduced new visual forms of groundbreaking ways of thinking. Frida and Diego were hearty participants in this culture flowering. Frida especially came to notoriety not only with her passionate depictions of physical suffering and pain, but also her colorful vision of Mexican cultural themes, revolutionary ideas, and bold feminist force. Psychoanalysis, emerging as a dominant intellectual movement in this pivotal era, introduces new perspectives on human behavior and culture formation. Freud's theories, originating in his clinical practice, also fueled a broader ethos of critical discourse. Yet dark clouds loomed on the horizon, and the streets of Europe, with the rise to power of Nazism in 1933, anti-Semitism sentiment pervaded the culture, and the Third Reich became bolder in its restrictions on Jewish businesses, basic freedoms, and the ability of Jews to participate in daily activities such as schools and social events. Finally, Nazi-sanctioned violence erupted, strict segregation was enforced, and deportations began until there was no longer any escape from the relentless Nazi plan to murder every Jew in Europe. In the midst of these horrors, in 1939, Freud published his own form of attack on his fellow Jews, the accusation that the biblical scripture was a lie, that Moses was actually an Egyptian, and his followers had murdered him, and that religion itself was a psychological mental illness. In response to these calamities of the era, a significant number of artists and intellectuals pursued new forms of spirituality and meaning. In his 1944 manifesto, Mexican muralist David Siqueiros effectively encapsulated this tension by asserting that modern art must respond to the modern social movement, end quote, suggesting that artists were obligated to address both political and spiritual demands. This dialectic between materialist analysis and spiritual aspirations has a significant correspondence to the dialogue between Freud's text and Frida's painting. Frida's Moses critiques Freud's philosophical interpretation of an adapted biblical narrative by creating a composition that encourages viewers to engage with both artistic and socio-cultural interpretations. The interaction between Frida's Moses and Freud's Moses in monotheism marks a critical moment in 20th century intellectual history, where visual art engages directly with that philosophical and psychoanalytical theory. Frida confronts this assumptions that underlie Freud's analysis by incorporating a non-Western spiritual traditions, female perspectives on divine and human nature, and indigenous gnosis. Frida integrates politics, religion, and myth as a combination of viewpoints on the human condition and the divine. Her synchronistic approach reveals the reductionist tendencies in Freud's traditional psychoanalytic arguments that deconstruct religious belief into psychological mechanisms. She illustrates how different worldviews, cultural traditions, and belief systems often converge, presenting a perspective that religious inspiration and worldly knowledge can coexist. The artwork visually transcends its historical setting, showing how art can provide sophisticated insight beyond the bounds of analytical thought into a dialogue between spiritual and materialistic worldviews. In exploring the interplay between visual art and written narratives, Frida Kahlo's Moses exemplifies how art can transcend the limitations of languages, offering nuanced and inclusive perspectives on complex and often divisive themes. Frida achieves this in her Moses painting by depicting scenes from various perspectives, including characters from many faiths and political persuasions. Through this cornucopia, she affirms religious harmony while challenging both the atheist and exclusivist viewpoint, and would otherwise dismiss many of the beliefs and traditions she expresses in her universalistic syncretism. Quote, I painted the Moses fresco because I felt an intense interest in the story of the different religions and their origins, especially now, after this terrible war, end quote. This reflects her intent to use Moses as a unifying symbol connecting diverse religious narratives to address universal human questions. The painting presents a complex visual narrative and invites analysis both in its formal structure and symbolic content. The painting composition centers on the figure of Moses in a papyrus basket in the Nile. This classical portrayal of the scriptural narrative charts the continuation of the Abrahamic religions of the Hebrews. With Frida's trickster vision, she adds the third eye of Eastern religions and beliefs onto the baby's forehead, as she has done with assortment of paintings. The third eye is not an afterthought, but rather a luminary focal point of her painting, reinforced by the dripping waters of the female life force, the amniotic fluid. And the baby guides the observer through a birth canal, signaling that this is an unorthodox interpretation of Exodus. After passing the guardian figure of baby Moses, the viewer enters a cluttered space with no definitive path to follow. Navigating through the crowded depiction of familiar faces, the observer encounters their own pre-existing beliefs about symbols and historical events. All the figures in the painting are unified under a single sun, representing the solar deity Atum of ancient Egypt, the very monotheistic religion that Freud claims influenced Moses. However, where Freud narrows his focus to trace Jewish monotheism back to Egyptian origins, Frida embodies what she terms, quote, the inherent unity of human spiritual quest, unquote. Her painting Moses, or Nucleus of Creation, thus offers a broader vision, capturing both metaphysical and pragmatic influences that shaped 20th century thought through religious pluralism and pantheistic understanding. The formal composition employs a radial structure with the infant Moses at the center from which all other elements emanate. Frida's integration of indigenous Mexican culture elements alongside Western religious symbols serve multiple purposes, both challenging Freud's text and revealing her revolutionary stance. Following the Mexican Revolution, muralist David Alfaro Siqueiros argued that, quote, art must serve the people and belong collectively to the people, quote, advocating to, quote, socialize artistic expression and wipe out bourgeois individualism, end quote. Frida achieves this socialist vision by presenting indigenous wisdom as complementary to established religious traditions, demonstrating how all cultures and symbols can help resolve humanity's universal questions. The overall effect of these formal and thematic elements is to create what Valet Export might recognize as a feminist critique of patriarchal religious narrative, asserting, quote, if reality is a social construction and men are in its engineers, then we are confronted by a masculine reality. We, women, must participate in the construction of reality through the elements of the media. By reimagining Moses not as a singular father figure of monotheism that Freud described, but rather as a child surrounded by multiple nurturing spiritual traditions, Frida emphasizes how traditional analytical framework have often constrained the understanding of religion. The painting suggests that spiritual truth emerges not through the triumph of one system over others, but through the recognition of their fundamental interconnectedness. In contrast to Frida's generous and rich tapestry of worldwide spirituality, Freud produces a profound diversion to the sacred text of the Jewish people. Freud's Moses and monotheism presents a radical reinterpretation of religious origins. The text, written in his exile from Nazi-occupied Vienna, attempts to rationalize religious belief by examining the psychological underpinnings of monotheism. This central argument of Moses and monotheism revolves around Freud's claim that Moses created the Jewish people. They owe their existence to them, end quote. This assertion positions Moses as the construct of collective psychology rather than a historical figure. Through this lens, Freud argues that religious systems emerge not from divine intervention, but from human psychological needs and traumas. Freud develops his analysis through two primary frameworks, and we're going to just go to the end here. We have 5 minutes?
3 minutes.
Okay, I'll just go to the end. Okay. Moses, by positioning Moses as the architect of Jewish identity rather than its divinely inspired messenger, Freud fundamentally shifts the focus from godly to the human agency in religious development to redefine Judaism. Freud begins his treatise with the extraordinary and almost apologetic statement, quote, To deny a people the man whom it praises as the greatest of its sons is not a deed to be undertaken lightly, end quote. Yet that is exactly what Freud proceeds to do. A very bold move, especially considering the thunderous vilification that Freud would inevitably receive from the Jewish scholarly. At its core, Freud's book represents his efforts to rationalize religion, rejecting the idea of divine revelation to understand it through the manifestation of collective psychological process. In the decades following Totem and Taboo, Freud develops his theory that religious and neurotic behaviors share fundamental psychological structures. Religious phenomena, he later maintains, and quote, are to be understood only on the model of neurotic symptoms of the individual, end quote. He thus constrains religion into a collective coping mechanism for historical trauma. His linear analysis, attempting to trace monotheism through historical psychological cause and effect, stands in sharp contrast to Frida's panoramic vision, where multiple traditions and meanings coexist without hierarchy. While Freud and Frida both engage with religious and cultural history through Moses, their methodological approaches represent fundamentally different psychological positions, one that interprets spiritual experience through psychological mechanisms, and another that expands it through inclusive multicultural vision.